Hey everyone, in this video, I wanted to show you another automation and orchestration tool that we've put together. Actually, I put together before this latest version of Synapse software became a thing, before we started building the Cherwell archive tool. Um, and it's something that I'm running myself. I've been running it in production for a couple of years. I'm looking over at my notes and it says 2 years ago. So this has been around for at least a couple of years. I'm using it in my own systems, and it's basically a tool to allow you to run um, whatever you want as a kind of sort of as a Linux service. There are some things in here that are kind of designed specifically for Linux, but theoretically the concept is cross-platform. So I actually develop it on a Mac, run it on Linux. We'll talk about that uh, in a little bit more detail. But before I do that, I wanted to remind you that the Cortex Users Group is something that we host every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time. You can find a link down in the description below to join that, to get an invite to that. We talk about mostly Cortex things, but we also talk about some of the other things that are kind of related to what we're doing with Cortex. Some of the other tooling that we use to implement Cortex and support Cortex, Thing Runner being one of them. So if you have questions about that, feel free to stop by. Again, you can find a link down in the description to get an invite. Now, how does Thing Runner kind of fit into the overall landscape of everything that we're doing here at Synapse Software? Last week, I talked about Astromech and um, Whiskey, our deployment tool, and this kind of starts to put together this spectrum, if you will, right? We've got Cortex, obviously started as an archive tool and has grown into a a platform, more or less. It's intended to handle your email. It can start to handle some of your data, and that's separate from the archive tool capabilities, but built on some of the things that we've learned while we were building the archive tool, some of the foundational aspects. It's basically a second product within the same product line. And now that's very IT operations focused, um, and starts us getting into this world of what other things can we automate. So obviously, Astromech is kind of the other end of the spectrum from being, Cortex being very low code, no code. Astromech is, well, if you have a bunch of code, how do you start to automate that? And then somewhere in between, you have things like continuous deployment, or in the case of this, it's maybe not continuous deployment, but kind of orchestration, right? So how do you get the code and the services that you've already built into a scenario where you can start to run them in production and not have to write a bunch of code in order to make that happen every single time? And that's the story behind Thing Runner. So I'm going to switch over to my screen, uh, and this is an open source tool. It is on GitHub. Um, and you can kind of read the backstory here. Um, but basically, where Thing Runner came from is I was building tools. I was building primarily web applications, but network connected services, and I wanted to deploy them. I didn't want to always deploy to Kubernetes, or I was using Amazon's Elastic Container Service a lot and kind of liked the concept of how they did things, but it was always a pain to stand up all the resources and get everything configured right and that sort of thing. And for some cases, I didn't want a full infrastructure just to like test out an application, or just get it running kind of internally, right? I have compute resources. I had a few VPSs. I just wanted to take my code, stick it on the VPS, and call it good. Of course, most applications are a little bit more complicated than that, a little bit more involved. They need some sort of database. They need some sort of URL or something like that. Um, and they probably rely on other services. Who knows? So it was, kind of a pain. I also didn't want to be tied to AWS, right? ECS is nice, but it is AWS specific. Azure has its own version of things, but it speaks a different language. It's a different configuration process. You have to go through the either their CLI or their API or through the UI. Each one is different. You could do something with Terraform, but then you're learning yet another thing. Um, and I wanted to be able to just run a command line and say, run this thing. Now, there is a little bit of configuration, I will warn you. Um, but the idea basically being, I have this service, let's run it, and let's have it kind of behave like a Linux service. So this also spun out of, I mentioned that Astromech spun out of something that I used to build or that I had before called R2D2. Well, this kind of also spun out of the same sort of thing. The idea being, I had a bunch of .NET apps that I wanted to start and stop like Windows server, or in this case, Linux services, right? I just wanted to be able to run etc init service start or launch control start, that sort of thing, and have it do the thing, not have to worry about building the launch control or the systemd configuration or the initd script or whatever. Just wanted to run like start, just do the thing. So that's where Thing Runner came from. There's a little bit of instructions here. I think it is still actually .NET 7, but that can easily be remedied. There's some installation. There is a REST server. So Thing Runner started out as a CLI, very specifically, added a REST server to it, which is optional. You don't have to run the REST server. And actually, the REST server you can see here is a Thing Runner service. So it is defined within the same ecosystem. Um, and if you install that and enable that, it allows you to say ping Thing Runner from your CI/CD pipeline and let it know that, hey, there's a new update. Go update this service. Um, I actually have plans to make this even easier, so it can link up with, if you're using GitLab, it can link up with GitLab and say, oh, there's a new update to this thing. Let's automatically update, that sort of thing. Now, in order to do that, there is some security involved. You can you create a new token and say, hey, create a new token for this purpose, and then uh, you use that as part of your authorization header, that sort of thing. Now, how do you configure a service? Basically, as simple as setting up a JSON document, specifying the name and the description, which is really just for readability purposes. And then each service is a list of tasks. Each task has a type. Right now, Docker and script, I think, are permitted, are supported right now. And then you can set environment variables. And in the case of Docker, you have a few different options. Um, and then Thing Runner will just run the service as you have defined it. And it's really just as simple as that, right? If you can run it from the command line, you can run it from Thing Runner. It is that simple. Um, Aside from, you got to write a JSON document. But then you just run thing start. Where was it? Yeah, thing start. And if you set this up in your configuration folder, which on Linux is, I think, etc things, then yeah, here you go. Things start, things stop, things update, and it knows, depending on what type of service it is, it knows how to update the service and kind of restart itself. Um, and again, this is open source and very extensible. So lots of different things that can be added to this. So that's about it that I want to show for Thing Runner. But hopefully, that gives a good overview. If you have any questions at all about it, feel free to show up to the Cortex users group. I know it's the Cortex users group, but we can talk about other things related to Cortex as well. If you have questions that you want to ask by email, go ahead and email me. My email address is in the description down below. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.